The morning I walked back into that boardroom, I wore the same dress I had worn the day they passed me over. Not because I hadn't thought about it. I had thought about it for 6 months, which is how long it took me to build what I was about to set on that table, and in those 6 months I had thought about almost everything, including what I would wear when the morning finally came. I had considered power suits, and I had considered understated professionalism, and I had considered the specific visual statement of a woman who had arrived somewhere she was told she couldn't go and wanted the room to feel the distance traveled. And then I had decided on the dress. The navy dress with the three-quarter sleeves and the collar that was neither too formal nor too casual. The dress I had been wearing when David Chen stood at the head of the boardroom of Hargrove Capital Partners and presented 37 slides of research that I had built, word by word and number by number and argument by argument, in the 8 weeks before the promotion panel convened. The dress I had been wearing when the panel voted 4-1 to give the managing director position to David instead of me. The dress I had been wearing when Richard Hargrove, the founder and CEO, looked at me across the table with the expression of a man delivering something he believed was a kindness and said, "Maya, we feel you're an exceptional analyst, but we have some concerns about whether you're ready for the leadership demands of this role." I had worn that dress the day they broke something. I was going to wear it the day I showed them what had been built from the breaking. My name is Maya Josephine Ackhaffer. I am 36 years old. I have a master's degree in financial economics from Columbia and 7 years of experience at Hargrove Capital Partners, which is a mid-sized private equity firm in New York City with $4 billion of assets under management, and a boardroom on the 34th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows that look out over Manhattan in a way that was designed to make everyone who sat in it feel the specific weight of what was at stake. I felt that weight every time I walked in. I had been walking in for 7 years. I had been carrying the weight for longer than that. This is the story of what I built when they told me I was not ready to carry it with the title. Before I tell you about the boardroom, I need to tell you about the research. Because the research is where the story actually begins, and because understanding the research means understanding what was taken, and what the taking cost, and what the building back required. The research started 18 months before the promotion panel. It started with a question that I had been turning over in my mind for 2 years before that, which is long enough for a question to become something more than curiosity and less than obsession, which is the right temperature for the kind of work that produces something real. The question was this: why do certain portfolio companies that look identical on paper, same sector, same market position, same leverage ratios, same management team credentials, perform so differently over a 5-year hold period? Not slightly differently, dramatically differently. In the private equity world where Hargrove operated, the difference between a deal that returns 2.5 times your money and a deal that returns 5 times your money is not always visible in the initial underwriting. It should be. The entire premise of the industry is that disciplined analysis can identify and price that difference before you write the check. but the evidence, at least in Hargrove's own portfolio, suggested that the analysis was missing something. I had been looking at Hargrove's portfolio data for 2 years as part of my regular work, and what I had seen, gradually, the way you see something that is there before you have the language to describe it, was a pattern. Companies where the operational leadership team had a specific quality of internal communication performed better than companies where the same quality was absent. The quality was not describable by any metric that Hargrove used in its standard diligence process. It was not about leadership experience or market share or EBITDA margins. It was something more granular, something that lived in the texture of how decisions got made and how information moved through an organization, and whether the people who knew things that mattered were in rooms where that knowledge could be received. I had been describing this pattern to myself for 2 years before I decided to build the framework that made it measurable. That was the research. I spent 8 months building a proprietary assessment framework that could evaluate organizational communication quality in a way that was rigorous and replicable, and that generated a score. I called it the Internal Capital Index, or ICI, that correlated, in my back testing across Hargrove's existing portfolio, with 5-year performance outcomes at a rate that was statistically significant and practically significant, and that, if it held up in prospective application, would change the way Hargrove underwrote deals. The ICI was the most significant piece of original research I had produced in 7 years at Hargrove. It was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that, in an industry where competitive advantage is the only thing that matters and where proprietary analytical tools are the currency of that advantage, could be worth tens of millions of dollars over the life of a fund. I knew what I had. I had been careful about who else knew. The promotion process at Hargrove Capital was not opaque. The criteria were stated, the timeline was established, and the panel that made the decision was known. 3 of the 5 panelists were members of the investment committee. 1 was the head of operations. 1 was an external advisor who had been on Hargrove's advisory board for 12 years and who I knew primarily from the annual investor conference where he asked good questions from the audience. I had been told 6 months before the formal process began by Richard Hargrove in a one-on-one meeting that he was encouraging me to put my name forward for the managing director position. He had said, "Maya, you are one of the strongest analytical minds we have ever had in this firm. I want you to think seriously about this." I had said, "I am thinking seriously about it." He had said, "Good. The role requires someone who can take our analytical capability to the next level, and I think you have that in you." I had taken that conversation as the encouragement it was intended to be. I had begun preparing my promotion case. The promotion case at Hargrove required a presentation to the panel. 45 minutes, structured around your track record, your vision for the role, and your specific contribution to the firm's competitive position. This last element was the one that mattered most, because Hargrove's culture was built around the idea that senior leadership needed to be generating proprietary advantage, not merely executing against someone else's framework. I had the ICI. I had 8 months of research behind it. I had back-tested data across 23 portfolio companies. I had a prospective application case built around 3 active deals in Hargrove's pipeline, where I believed the ICI would differentiate the underwriting in ways that would be visible in the returns. I had exactly what the promotion case required. The question was not whether I had it. The question was who else knew I had it. And the answer to that question is where the story turns ugly. David Chen had been at Hargrove for 4 years, which was 3 years less than me. He was 33, Harvard MBA, with the specific confidence of a man who had been told from early in his career that he was going places, and who had internalized that information as fact rather than as motivation. He was good at his job. I want to say that clearly because accuracy requires it. He was a capable analyst and a strong presenter, and he had a quality that I had observed over 4 years of working alongside him, which was the ability to make other people's thinking sound like his own without the mechanics of the borrowing being visible. I had not protected my research carefully enough. That is the truth, and I am telling it plainly because I think plain truth is required for this story to mean what it needs to mean. I had shared elements of the ICI framework with David in the context of work we had done together on 2 active deals, because collaboration was the culture at Hargrove, and because I believed that sharing thinking with colleagues made the thinking better, and because I had not yet fully understood what David was doing with what I shared. What he was doing, as I found out later, was building a presentation. His promotion case presentation. He presented it to the panel on a Thursday in April. I presented mine the following Monday. The panel met to deliberate on the Wednesday after that. I did not know, going into my presentation, that David had presented the ICI. I did not know until I was sitting in the conference room adjacent to the boardroom on Monday afternoon, waiting to be called in, and my colleague Priya, who had been in David's Thursday presentation as a support analyst, and who came to find me in the conference room with the expression of someone who had been carrying a thing they needed to put down, told me. She said, "Maya, I need to tell you something before you go in there." I said, "Okay." She said David's presentation on Thursday was built around a framework for organizational communication quality assessment. He called it the Internal Alignment Index. It was based on your work, your categories, your methodology, your back-test data. He repositioned it and renamed it and presented it as something he had been developing. I sat very still. I said, "How much of it?" She said, "Almost all of it. The core framework, the assessment dimensions, the scoring methodology." The back-test results he presented were from your data. He changed some of the terminology and restructured the presentation, but the substance was yours. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "How did the panel receive it?" Priya said, "They loved it." Richard said it was exactly the kind of proprietary capability development he was looking for in a managing director candidate. I sat with that for a longer moment. Then I said, "Okay." Priya said, "Maya," I said, "thank you for telling me." I mean that. Now I need to go into that boardroom and give my presentation. Priya said, "How are you going to?" I said, "I'm going to give my presentation. The one I prepared, which includes the ICI in its complete form, and I am going to let the panel see both versions and make whatever determination they make. Priya said, I said, that's what I'm going to do. She looked at me. She said, okay. I went into the boardroom. My presentation was 43 minutes. I know because I had timed it precisely, and I executed it within 2 minutes of that time. I presented the ICI in its complete form, with the full methodology and the complete back test data, and the prospective application case for the 3 pipeline deals. I presented it with the calm of a woman who had built every page of it and knew every number in it, and could answer any question from any direction, because the research was mine all the way to its foundation. The panel listened. Richard asked 3 questions, all of which were good questions, all of which I answered completely. The external advisor asked 2 questions that suggested he had heard something similar recently, which was not a surprise. The head of operations asked about implementation, which was the right question and one I had prepared for. Then the panel thanked me, and I left the boardroom and went back to my desk, and I worked for the rest of the afternoon, because the work did not stop, because something terrible was happening alongside it. The panel deliberated for 2 days. On Friday afternoon, Richard's assistant called me into his office. Richard Hargrove was 64 years old, the founder of a $4 billion firm, a man who had built something real over 30 years, and who had, in my experience, the capacity for genuine respect and the simultaneous capacity for a specific kind of blindness that I had been navigating for 7 years. He was not malicious. I want to say that because it is true, and because the story requires truth even when the truth is complicated. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had built his world with a specific set of assumptions inside it and who had never been sufficiently required to examine those assumptions. He said, Maya, I want to share the panel's decision and have a conversation about it. I said, okay. He said, the panel has voted to offer the managing director position to David. I said, I see. He said, I want you to know that this was a difficult decision. Your presentation was strong. Your track record is strong. The panel has enormous respect for your analytical capabilities, I said, but he paused. He said, the panel has some concerns about the leadership dimensions of the role. Managing director requires not only analytical excellence, but the ability to lead and inspire a team, to manage client relationships at the senior level, to navigate the political dimensions of the investment committee with a certain equanimity. I said, equanimity. He said, yes. There were moments in discussions we've had this year where we felt that where the panel felt that you could sometimes let your investment in the work affect your professional composure. We think David brings a certain steadiness that the role requires. I said, I let my investment in the work affect my professional composure. He said, Maya, I want to be clear that this is not a criticism of your commitment. It is a recognition that managing director requires a specific set of leadership qualities, and I said, Richard, I need to ask you something directly. He said, of course. I said, did the panel observe that David's presentation on Thursday incorporated research that I have been developing for 8 months? Richard was quiet for a moment. He said, David's presentation and yours covered some similar territory. The panel saw that as evidence that both of you had been developing thinking in the same area, which they viewed positively as an indication of where the firm's analytical focus should be. I said, similar territory. He said, yes. I looked at him. I said, Richard, the internal alignment index that David presented on Thursday and the internal capital index that I presented on Monday are the same framework, same assessment dimensions, same methodology, same back-test data from the same portfolio companies. The terminology was changed. The presentation structure was different. The underlying work is mine. Richard looked at me. He said, that's a significant claim, Maya. I said, it is an accurate one. He said, David has been working on organizational assessment methodology for some time. I've heard him discuss it in various contexts. I said, in various contexts where I was also present and had shared elements of my thinking in the course of collaborative work. Richard was quiet. I said, I have documentation. I have 8 months of research files with time stamps. I have email threads. I have the version history of every document in my analytical work product going back to the beginning of the project. If the panel would like to examine the provenance of the framework, I am prepared to provide that documentation. Richard said, Maya, I hear what you're saying, and I think this is a conversation that deserves careful consideration, but I also want to be honest with you. Even if there is some ambiguity about the development of this framework, the panel's decision was based on a range of factors including the leadership qualities I mentioned. I don't want you to feel that this one issue is the determining factor when it is not the only factor. I said, what were the other factors? He said, I've shared them with you. The equanimity question, the leadership readiness. I said, I would like to understand what specific behaviors led the panel to conclude that I lack equanimity. He shifted in his chair. He said, Maya, I don't think it would be productive to, I said. I'm asking because if there are specific behaviors that the panel identified as concerns, I would like to know what they are so that I can understand whether they are accurate, and if they are accurate, what I can do to address them. He said, it's more of a general impression than a specific incident. I said, a general impression. He said, yes, I said, a general impression that I am too emotional. He said, those aren't the words I used. I said, but those are the words that were used in the panel discussion. He looked at me. He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. I said, I understand. Thank you for the conversation, Richard. I stood up. I extended my hand. He shook it. I left his office. I went to the bathroom on the 33rd floor, which was the floor below the executive level, and I stood at the sink with the water running and I looked at myself in the mirror for approximately 90 seconds. Then I dried my hands. I went back to my desk. I worked until 8 o'clock that evening. I did not cry at my desk. Not because I did not feel the full weight of what had happened, not because the weight was insufficient to produce tears, but because crying at my desk was not the thing I was going to do. I had made that decision in the bathroom mirror. Not because tears were wrong. Because the specific way I was going to respond to this specific thing was not going to involve the behaviors they had already decided were evidence of my being too emotional. I was going to build something instead. I need you to subscribe to Black Diamonds right now, before this story goes any further. This channel exists for this exact story, for the woman who was told she was too emotional and built an empire in the hours after everyone else went home. For everyone who has had their work taken and their name left off it. For every person who has been told their investment in what they do is a liability rather than an asset. Subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your name and your city in the comments below. I want to know where in the world you are tonight, because this community is built for this story, and you are exactly who it is for. Now stay with me, because what I built in those 6 months is the reason you are here. The first 3 weeks after the panel decision were the hardest. I am telling you that directly because I do not want to give you the version of this story where the protagonist emerges from the unfair thing with immediate clarity and purpose and begins building immediately. The reality was 3 weeks of getting up in the morning and going to work and doing my job and sitting across the office from David Chen, who had been announced as the new managing director, and who behaved toward me with the specific awkward generosity of a person who has taken something from you and is trying to compensate by being very pleasant, which is its own kind of insult. 3 weeks of sitting in meetings where David was now the senior voice in the room, and where his authority was real and official and conferred by the panel, and where I was the exceptional analyst with the enormous respect of the firm and no title to show for it. 3 weeks of Priya checking in on me every few days with the look of a woman who was furious on my behalf and was managing her fury with the professional constraint of someone who understood that expressing it would cost her something she needed. 3 weeks of my mother calling on Sunday evenings and asking how things were and me saying fine because she had raised me and she would hear fine and know it was not fine, and she would say the right thing and the right thing would make me cry, and I was not ready to cry yet. 3 weeks of living in the gap between what had happened and what I was going to do about it. At the end of the 3rd week, on a Saturday morning in May, I sat at the kitchen table in my apartment with my coffee, and I opened my laptop, and I looked at the ICI documentation, and I thought about what I had. I had the research, the full research. Every file, every version, every time-stamped document going back 18 months. Every email where I had shared elements of the framework with David in the course of collaborative work, which meant every email that established both the sequence and the direction of the sharing. I had the documentation. I also had something I had not allowed myself to fully look at yet, which was the gap in the ICI. The thing that was not finished. The framework was built and back-tested, but the forward application, the actual deployment of the ICI in a live deal process, had not been done. The 3 pipeline deals I had mentioned in my presentation as prospective application cases were still active. The ICI had not been applied to any of them. I had the framework. I had the methodology. I had the research. And I had 6 active months ahead of me before Hargrove's next investor conference, at which the new managing director was scheduled to present the firm's proprietary analytical capabilities to the limited partners. I closed my laptop. I finished my coffee. I started building. What I built in those 6 months, I am going to describe to you in a specific way. Not because I want you to understand the technical details of private equity analytics. I do not. But because I want you to understand the nature of building, which is a thing that happens in the hours after everyone else has gone home, in the apartments that are quiet at midnight, in the early mornings before the world has woken up and started making demands, in the margins of a professional life that is simultaneously being fully lived in the daylight. I built 3 things. The first thing was the complete application of the ICI to the 3 active pipeline deals. This meant taking the framework and deploying it in real diligence, actually going into the companies and applying the assessment, which required site visits and management interviews and data collection that I did not announce to the firm as a formal initiative, because I was not in a position to announce formal initiatives. I did it alongside my regular work, in the hours I had, using the relationships I had built in 7 years that allowed me to request access without it being unusual. The 3 companies were in different sectors: healthcare services, logistics, and specialty retail, and the ICI produced different scores for each of them. The healthcare services company scored in the top quartile. The logistics company scored in the middle. The specialty retail company scored in the bottom quartile on 2 of the 5 assessment dimensions. The significance of these scores would become apparent later. The second thing I built was the forward testing validation study. This sounds more intimidating than it is. What I did was identify 23 companies in the broader market that were at similar stages of their investment life cycle as Hargrove's portfolio companies had been when I back-tested the original data. And I applied the ICI to publicly available information about those companies, and then tracked their performance over the subsequent period against the ICI predictions. This was the thing I worked on at midnight. This was the thing I was building when everyone else had gone home. The validation study required 6 months because that was the minimum time period that produced statistically meaningful performance data. 6 months from May to November, which meant I was finishing it approximately 3 weeks before the investor conference in December. The third thing I built was the legal documentation. I worked with an attorney, an intellectual property specialist named Dr. Patricia Mensah, who I had been connected to through a mutual professional contact. And together, we built the complete provenance record for the ICI. Every document, every email, every version history, every piece of evidence that established that the internal capital index had been created by Maya Josephine Ockhafer over a period of 18 months beginning in the fall of 2 years prior. Dr. Mensah looked at my documentation and said, after reviewing it for a week, "You have a clear and well-documented claim of intellectual property ownership on this framework." She said it the way lawyers say things when they mean the case is strong. I said, "What are my options?" She said, "Several. You can file for trade secret protection. You can pursue a claim of misappropriation against David Chen and potentially against Hargrove Capital as the entity that benefited from the misappropriation. You can also use this documentation in a negotiation, which may be more efficient than litigation." I said, "Tell me about the negotiation option." She did. I thought about it for 2 weeks. Then I chose the negotiation option, but I did not choose it in the way you might think. I did not choose it as a settlement. I chose it as a presentation. The twist in this story is not the one you have been expecting. I know that some of you have been waiting for the moment when I expose David Chen in a public and satisfying way, when the evidence of what he did gets laid on the table, and the people in the room understand what happened and David's career ends in the specific way that careers should end when they are built on someone else's work. That is not this twist. The twist is about Richard Hargrove's daughter. Her name was Alina Hargrove, and she was 30 years old, and she had been working at a venture capital firm in San Francisco for 5 years. And she was, according to the firm's website, the head of their portfolio operations team. And she had been at Hargrove Capital's investor conference the previous year as a guest of her father's. And she had sat in the front row of the presentation room and asked 3 questions after my presentation on the firm's portfolio analytics approach. Questions that were sharp and specific and that I had enjoyed answering. I had not thought much about Alina Hargrove after that conference. Alina Hargrove had apparently thought about me. I found out in October, 5 months into my 6-month build, when I received an email from an address I did not recognize. The email was brief. It said, "Dr. Ackhaffer, I hope this finds you well. This is Alina Hargrove. I attended last year's investor conference and heard your presentation on portfolio analytics. I've been thinking about some of what you discussed, and I'd love to find time to connect if you're open to it. I have some questions I think you would be well positioned to answer." Best, Alina. I stared at the email for a long moment. Then I replied and said, I would be glad to connect. We had coffee 2 weeks later at a cafe in Midtown, and Alina Hargrove sat across from me with the directness of someone who had been raised by a man who built things and had inherited the orientation without the institutional loyalty. She said, "I want to be direct with you." I said, "Please." She said, "I know about the promotion decision. I know about the panel vote. My father told me, not in detail, but enough. And I have some questions about the analytical work that was presented at the panel, specifically the organizational assessment framework." I said, "What would you like to know?" She said, "I'd like to know whose it is." I looked at her. She said, "I have my own reasons for asking. I have been working on something related in the venture context, and I want to understand the intellectual landscape before I go further. And I think I already know the answer to my question based on what I saw at last year's conference versus what I heard my father describe from the panel presentations." I said, "The internal capital index is mine. I developed it over 18 months. I have complete documentation establishing that provenance." She said, "I thought so." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She said, "I'm going to tell you something that may or may not surprise you. My father's firm is preparing to present at the December investor conference, and the new managing director is scheduled to present the organizational assessment methodology as a key proprietary capability of the firm." I said, "I know." She said, "And you're planning to do something about that." I said, "I'm planning to be at the conference." Alina looked at me with the look of her father that she had inherited along with the directness. the look that assessed and arrived at a conclusion and then committed to it. She said, "I think you should know something. The 3 pipeline deals that were referenced in the presentations to the panel, my father mentioned them to me when discussing the new approach. 2 of those deals have progressed. One of them, the specialty retail one, is not progressing the way the initial underwriting suggested it would. There have been operational issues at the leadership level. Communication breakdown between the management team and the board. The investment committee is concerned." I sat very still. I said, "What kind of communication breakdown?" She said, "The kind that your framework would have predicted from what I understand of it. Bottom quartile scores on the dimensions that correlate with this specific failure mode." I said, "How do you know what my framework would have predicted?" She said, "Because I spent 3 weeks last year studying everything you presented at the conference and then reading everything I could find about organizational communication and performance correlation, and I built my own version of your logic, independently, in the venture context, and my version of it would have flagged that company. Which means yours would have too." I looked at her. She said, "I'm not sure my father fully understands what he has and what he doesn't have. The framework that David presented was your framework repositioned. But the application of it, the live diligence work, the forward testing, has any of that been done?" I said, "Not by David." She said, "By you?" I said, "Yes." Elena put her coffee cup down. She said, "Then you have something that the firm doesn't know exists." I said, "Yes." She said, "And the investor conference is in 6 weeks." I said, "Yes." She said, "I think we should talk about what happens at that conference." We talked for 3 hours. I want to tell you about Elena Hargrove with the same accuracy I have brought to everything else in this story, which means telling you that she was not simply an ally who appeared from nowhere and smoothed my path. She was a person with her own interests, her own analytical perspective, and her own complicated relationship with her father's firm. She was also, genuinely and without performance, angry about what had happened. Not on my behalf sentimentally, but on principle. She said at one point in our 3-hour conversation, "I have spent 5 years in venture watching this dynamic. The person who does the work and the person who presents the work are frequently not the same person, and the gap between those 2 people is not random. It tracks. It tracks in ways that the industry does not like to examine and that I have been trying to figure out how to address without getting dismissed as too." She stopped. I said, "Too emotional?" She said, "Yes." That word. That exact word. We looked at each other across the table. I said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I want to help you walk into that conference with everything you have, and I want to be in the room when you do it." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I am going to run my own fund one day. And I am going to need to know that what I build is protected and recognized and attributed to me. And watching you do this, watching this happen correctly, is part of what that future looks like." I said, "That's an honest answer." She said, "I am my father's daughter in some ways." I said, "I noticed." She almost smiled. We talked about the conference. We talked about what I had and what I was still building and what the timeline required and what the conversation with Richard Hargrove needed to look like before the conference and whether it should happen before or at the conference. By the end of the 3 hours, we had a plan. The conversation with Richard Hargrove happened on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks before the investor conference, and I requested it directly, which was not unusual because I had standing meeting access with senior leadership as part of my role. I walked into his office with a folder. Not a laptop, not a presentation. A folder. The folder contained 32 pages. A summary of the ICI provenance documentation, a summary of the forward application work I had done on the 3 pipeline deals, including the specialty retail company scoring, and a summary of the 6-month validation study results. It also contained a 1-page document that Dr. Mensah had prepared, which was not a legal filing and was not a threat of litigation. It was a professional notification of intellectual property claim, the kind of document that establishes clearly and formally that a claim exists without initiating formal proceedings. It was, as Dr. Mensah had described it, a door opener rather than a door closer. I sat across from Richard Hargrove. I set the folder on the desk. I said, "Richard, I'd like to share something with you that I've been working on." He looked at the folder. He said, "Of course." I opened it. I took him through it in 22 minutes. I did not raise my voice. I did not let my investment in the work affect my professional composure. I was the temperature of a woman who had processed everything she needed to process and had arrived at a place where equanimity was not a performance but a fact. And the fact of it was built on 6 months of work at midnight and on Saturday mornings, and in the hours between what they decided and what I decided to do about what they decided. I took him through the provenance documentation first. I said, "This establishes the development timeline and authorship of the internal capital index. Every document is time-stamped and version-controlled. I can provide access to the complete file archive." He looked at the summary. He was very quiet. I took him through the live application work next. I said, "These are the ICI scores for the 3 pipeline deals referenced in both panel presentations. The healthcare services company scored in the top quartile. The logistics company scored in the middle range. The specialty retail company scored in the bottom quartile on 2 critical dimensions. I would like to draw your attention to the specialty retail score and cross-reference it with the operational concerns the investment committee has been discussing." Richard looked up. I said, "The bottom quartile scores on dimensions 3 and 4 of the ICI specifically predict the type of management board communication breakdown that has been observed at that company since the initial investment. The framework identified this risk at the diligence stage. That diligence was not applied because the framework was presented as a conceptual capability rather than an operational one, and the application work had not been completed by the person who presented it. I have completed that work." Richard was very still. I took him through the validation study last. I said, "This is the 6-month forward testing results across 23 market comparables. The ICI predictions correlated with outcomes at a rate of 73%, which is statistically significant at the p equals 0.01 level. This is the prospective validation that elevates the framework from a back-tested hypothesis to an evidence-based analytical tool." I closed the folder. I said, "Richard, the investor conference is in 3 weeks. The new managing director is scheduled to present the organizational assessment methodology as a key proprietary capability of the firm. I want to have a conversation about what that presentation looks like and who gives it." Richard looked at me. He said, "Maya," I said, "I am not here to make this difficult. I am here because the work is mine. The documentation establishes that clearly, and I have spent 6 months completing the application and validation that make this a deployable capability rather than a conceptual framework. I am also here because the specialty retail situation is developing in a way that the investment committee needs to understand through the lens of the ICI analysis. And the person who can walk them through that analysis is me." He said, "You're asking for," I said, "I am asking for the investor conference presentation. I am asking for attribution of the ICI to its correct author. And I am asking for a conversation about what my role at this firm reflects the work I have been doing and will continue to do." He said, "And if those conversations don't go the way you're asking," I held up the last page of the folder. I said, "Dr. Mensah can tell you what happens next in that scenario." But I want to be clear that my preference is not that scenario. My preference is the scenario where this firm has a real proprietary analytical capability that is properly attributed and fully developed and deployed in a way that generates the returns we told our limited partners we were positioned to generate. He looked at the notification of claim. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I need 24 hours. I said, "Of course." I stood up. I said, "I want to say one more thing." He said, "Yes." I said, "When you told me the panel had concerns about my equanimity, I want you to think about this conversation and tell me honestly whether what you are observing right now is a woman who is too emotional for a leadership role or a woman who has spent 6 months doing exactly what a leader does, which is identifying a problem and building a solution and walking into a room with the complete work and the documentation to support it." He looked at me, he said nothing, which was the right nothing. I left his office. He did not wait 24 hours. He called me at 7:15 the following morning. He said, "I'd like you to come in, with Alina." I said, "Alina is already planning to be in the city." He said, "I know. She called me last night." I said, "I see." He said, She has her mother's directness." I said, "I noticed." He said, "Come in at 9." I said, "I'll be there." The meeting at 9 was Richard, Alina, me, and the head of the investment committee, a woman named Sandra Park, who had been at Hargrove for 12 years, and who I had always found to be the clearest thinker in the room and the one most likely to engage with evidence on its own terms. Alina had not been to the firm in 6 months, since a family dinner the previous spring, and she walked in with the particular energy of someone who had arrived somewhere they intend to change and was not pretending otherwise. She sat beside me. She had her own folder. Richard began the meeting. He said, "I've asked Sandra to join us because the matters on the table involve investment decisions as well as firm governance. I want to make sure we have the right people in the room." Sandra looked at my folder and Alina's folder and said, "I assume I'm going to be reading some things this morning." I said, "Yes, I'll walk you through them." I took Sandra through the same material I had taken Richard through the previous day. She read faster than Richard had. She asked sharper questions. When I got to the specialty retail analysis, she put the page down and looked at the investment committee member in the room, which was herself, and said, "We've been discussing that situation for 6 weeks without understanding the root cause clearly. This framework identifies it specifically." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you applied this at the diligence stage." I said, "I applied it during the 6 months after the panel decision, using the opportunity I had to access the companies through my existing relationship work. It should have been applied at diligence. It wasn't because the person who presented the framework as a firm capability had not completed the application methodology." Sandra looked at Richard. Richard said nothing. She looked at Alina. Alina said, "I can speak to the venture application if it's helpful." I developed a parallel version of this logic independently, and I've been applying it in my own deal work for 4 months. The correlation data holds in the venture context. Sandra said, "What's your interest in this, Alina?" Alina said, "I'm raising a fund, and I want to be clear about what analytical capabilities I'm licensing and what I'm building independently." This conversation affects that clarity. Sandra looked at me. She said, "Maya, what do you want?" I said, "I want to give the investor conference presentation. I want the ICI attributed correctly, and I want a conversation about my role at this firm that reflects the work I have been doing." Sandra said, "The managing director conversation." I said, "Whatever conversation reflects the reality of the contribution." Sandra looked at Richard. Richard said, "Sandra, I think we need to have a conversation with David before we," Sandra said. Richard, "I think we need to have several conversations in a specific order, and I think the order starts with this one, which is already happening." Richard was quiet. Sandra said, "Maya, I'm going to ask you to give me 2 days to review the complete documentation and to have some conversations internally. And I'm going to ask you not to do anything with Dr. Mensah's letter in the interim." I said, "I can do that." She said, "Good." She picked up the folder. She said, "This is exceptional work." She said it simply, without decoration. "The way you say something that is true and does not require embellishment." I said, "Thank you, Sandra." She said, "The exceptional work has apparently been happening for some time. We should have been paying better attention." 2 days later, Sandra Park called me into her office. I want to tell you what happened in that office with the same precision I have brought to everything else. She said, "I've reviewed the complete documentation. I've spoken with 3 members of the investment committee, and I've had 2 conversations with Richard. There will be a 3rd conversation that involves David, which will happen separately from this one and which is not your business to manage." I said, "I understand." She said, "What I am prepared to offer you is this. You will give the investor conference presentation on the organizational assessment capability. The internal capital index will be presented under its original name with you as its author. The specialty retail situation will be addressed as part of the presentation with you walking the limited partners through the ICI analysis and its implications for the portfolio company." She paused. She said, "There will also be a title. The title is Managing Director, research, and portfolio analytics. It is a new role. It reflects the specific contribution you make rather than the general managing director role that was created for someone else. I want to be honest with you about that. I am not taking that role from David today. What I am doing is creating a role that is actually yours, that reflects what you have built and will continue to build, and that carries the authority and compensation appropriate to that work. I said, and David's role? She said, David's role will be addressed separately. I told you that. I said. What I am asking, Sandra, is whether the investment committee understands what happened. Whether the people who will be in the room at the investor conference understand the provenance of the work they will be presented. She said, yes, they understand. I said, all of them. She said, all of them, including the external advisor who was on the panel. He asked me when I briefed him whether there was a way to revisit the panel decision. I told him the situation was being addressed. He said, address it completely. I said, good. Sandra looked at me. She said, Maya, I want to say something that is not part of the formal offer. I said, okay. She said, I have been at this firm for 12 years. I have watched this specific pattern happen more times than I am comfortable naming. The work goes in one direction, and the credit goes in another, and the distance between the maps in a way that should be. It should have been something we addressed as a matter of structure rather than waiting for an individual to bring the documentation and sit in the office and make the case. That is a failure of this firm's governance, and I intend to address it formally, and I want you to know that your case is going to be part of how I make that argument to the investment committee. I looked at her. She said, you should not have had to do what you did to get here. I said, no, I should not have. She said, I'm sorry we made it necessary. I said, I accept that. And I want to say something back. She said, yes. I said, the 6 months were not wasted. The validation study exists because of the 6 months. The live application data exists because of the 6 months. The work is stronger for the time it took to build it, and I would not trade the strength of the work for a smoother path to this office. She looked at me. She said, that is either wisdom or generosity. I said, it's both. I was raised by someone who said they are the same thing. She almost smiled. She said, one more thing. I said, yes. She said, Elena has asked about licensing the ICI for use in her fund. That is a conversation between you and Elena and potentially between Hargrove and her fund, depending on how you want to structure it. I want you to know that the firm supports you having that conversation on your own terms. I said, thank you, Sandra. She extended her hand. I shook it. I left her office. I went to the bathroom on the 33rd floor. I stood at the sink with the water running. I looked at myself in the mirror. I allowed myself, finally, to cry, not for long, not with the loss of self-composure. The specific tears of a woman who has been holding something for 6 months and has arrived at a place where the hold can relax for a moment, where the weight can be felt for what it is now, that it does not need to be carried in the same way it was carried before. I cried for approximately 4 minutes. Then I dried my face. I went back to my desk. I opened the investor conference presentation that I had been building for 3 weeks. I started editing it. I wore the navy dress on the morning of the investor conference. I have already told you that. I told you at the beginning. but I want to tell you again because I want you to feel the full circle of it. The dress that I had been wearing when they broke something, and the dress I was wearing when I showed them what had been built from the breaking. The investor conference was at a hotel in Midtown. Hargrove's limited partners, the institutions and family offices and endowments and sovereign wealth funds that had committed capital to the firm, filled the ballroom to approximately 200 people. These were people who had given Hargrove billions of dollars and who needed to understand, every year at this conference, that the billions were being managed with the skill and the judgment and the proprietary capability that justified the fees and the trust. I was the fourth presenter of the morning. The agenda listed me as Maya Ockhafer, Managing Director, Research and Portfolio Analytics, which was the first time I had seen my name with that title and which I took 30 seconds to feel before moving past it. I walked to the front of the room. I set my folder on the podium. I looked at 200 people. I said, I'm Maya Ockhafer, and this morning I'm going to walk you through a proprietary analytical framework that Hargrove has developed over the past 18 months, which we call the Internal Capital Index. I did not look at David Chen during the presentation. He was in the third row, and I was aware of him the way you are aware of things at the edge of your field of vision that you have decided not to center. I was not there for David Chen. I was there for the 200 people who had trusted Hargrove with capital and who deserved to understand what that capital was protected by. I gave the presentation in 41 minutes. I walked them through the methodology. I walked them through the back test results. I walked them through the live application work on the 3 pipeline deals. When I got to the specialty retail company, which they had been briefed on in the morning's first session as a portfolio company with operational challenges, I said, I want to show you something. This is the ICI score for this company from the diligence stage analysis. You can see that dimensions 3 and 4, which measure management board communication integrity and decision escalation clarity, scored in the bottom quartile. What the framework predicts at this score level is exactly the kind of management board communication breakdown that has been documented over the past 3 months. This is not a retroactive observation. This is what the framework is designed to surface. The room was very quiet. I said, the purpose of showing you this is not to highlight a failure. It is to demonstrate that the analytical capability we have built can identify this kind of risk before it manifests. We did not apply the ICI to this deal at the diligence stage, and we should have. We are applying it going forward. And the lesson of this situation is part of how the framework is being refined and strengthened. I said, the investor conference is where we account to you for what we have done and what we will do. Today, I am accounting to you for a framework that has taken 18 months to build, 6 months to validate prospectively, and that represents the most significant proprietary analytical development in the firm's recent history. And I am telling you that it works. Not because a back test says so, because I have looked it in the eye on live deals with real money and the data holds. I said, that is what I built. That is what protects your capital. And that is what you can expect from this firm's research capability going forward. I closed the folder. 200 people clapped. I took 3 questions. The third question came from the external advisor who had been on the promotion panel. He stood at the microphone in the middle of the room and said, "Dr. Ockhafer, this is exceptional work. And I want to say, on behalf of everyone in this room, that we are glad it is in front of us today." I looked at him. I said, "So am I. Alina's fund, which she launched the following spring, licensed the ICI for use in its diligence process. The licensing agreement was structured between me personally and Alina's fund, with a portion flowing to Hargrove as part of my employment arrangement, which Sandra had negotiated with me directly. It was, as Dr. Mensah described it, a clean structure that reflected the actual ownership correctly. Alina said to me when the agreement was signed, "You know what my father said when I told him we were doing this?" I said, "What?" She said, "He said he was glad someone had finally paid attention to who was doing the work." I said, "Better late than never." She said, "I'm going to make sure it's not late at my fund. I'm putting structures in place from the beginning. Attribution tracking, research ownership documentation, promotion criteria that are specific rather than impressionistic." I said, "No equanimity assessments." She said, "Absolutely no equanimity assessments. That word is retired." I said, "From your fund?" She said, "From my fund. I can't retire it everywhere, but I can refuse to use it." I said, "That's a start." David Chen left Hargrove Capital 8 months after the investor conference. The terms of his departure were not announced publicly, and I am not going to describe them here because that is not my story to tell, and also because his departure is not the point of mine. The point of mine is not his going. The point is what I built. The point is the midnight hours and the Saturday mornings and the 3 companies and the 23 comparables and the validation study and the notebook I filled with the careful handwriting of a woman who was building something in the space where a title had not been given and who was going to bring what she built back to the room where the title had been withheld and set it on the table. The point is the table. What you set on it. Who you are when you set it. I want to tell you the broader thing now because this story has always been about something larger than one firm and one framework and one promotion decision. There is a specific taxonomy of words that gets used when certain people in certain rooms express certainty about things they know and invest in their work with the full weight of who they are. The words are too emotional, too aggressive, too much, not ready, not quite the right fit, needs to develop, lacks the equanimity. These words function as a vocabulary of reduction. They do not describe behaviors. They describe the discomfort of the person using them with the reality of a person they did not expect to be as cert and invested and prepared as that person is. The woman who knows her research is not too emotional. She is too inconvenient. She is too correct. She is too much of what the room told itself it was not going to have to deal with. And when the room uses the vocabulary of reduction in response to that too much, the room is making a calculation. It is calculating that the too much person will absorb the reduction and scale themselves down to the size the room is comfortable with, and then the room will not have to change its assumptions about who belongs in it. I did not absorb the reduction. I did not scale down. I went home. I built something. I brought it back. Not because I needed to prove something to the room. Because the work was real and it deserved to be real in the full light, attributed correctly, deployed completely, standing on its own evidence. Because the work was always mine and the work was always excellent, and the only thing that was preventing the work from being fully visible was the room's decision about who I was before I had finished speaking. I finished speaking at the investor conference. 200 people heard me. The room knew who I was. I had always known. If you are watching this story and you are building something in the hours after everyone else goes home, I want to say something directly to you. Build it completely. Build it with the rigor that makes it undeniable. Build it with the documentation that makes the provenance clear. Build it with the validation that elevates it from a good idea to an evidence-based truth. Build it in the midnight hours and the Saturday mornings, and the spaces that they did not take from you when they took the title, because the spaces are yours and what you build in them is yours, and no panel and no promotion decision and no vocabulary of reduction has the power to make what is built unbuild itself. And when it is built, bring it back to the room. Wear the navy dress. Set it on the table. Let the work speak in the voice it has earned. Because the work does not know it was built by someone who was told she was too emotional. The work only knows it was built completely and correctly and with everything the builder had. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is the whole thing. Subscribe to Black Diamonds right now. Hit the bell so you never miss a story. And drop your name and your city in the comments below. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. Tell me if you are building something in the hours after everyone else goes home. Tell me if someone has used the vocabulary of reduction on you and what you did with it. Drop a heart if you have ever been told you were too much. Drop a heart if you built something in the spaces they left you. Drop a heart if you believe the table is big enough for the work you are carrying. This community sees you, all of you, the whole size of you. Next week on Black Diamonds, a woman who signed a legal document she was told was standard, who spent 4 years building a company with her partner, who discovered on the morning of their Series B funding announcement that her co-founder had restructured the cap table in a way that reduced her ownership from 49% to 11%. What she found in the documents her co-founder did not know she had access to. What her attorney did when she made the call. And the board meeting that nobody in that room will ever forget. That story is coming. Make sure your notifications are on, because what she does in that board meeting changes everything. Until then, this is Black Diamonds. We see you. We have always seen you.